In 2016, this was a very confusing place to be. Designing streets is a little bit like being a detective. If you look hard enough, you can see the traces of all the decisions people made before.
Claire is the principal in charge of WXY, an architecture firm with a focus on urban design, planning, and community-based architecture.
I'm going to walk you through 3 street redesigns that WXY has done in New York City. Sometimes you hear the term bad street. There's no vegetation, there's nothing to look at, there's nothing to visit. Generally, people will go, oh my God, that's not a street I want to walk down. And therefore, it's not a great street. And the opportunity as an architect or landscape architect or urban designer is to kind of see what's happening, really listen and observe, because there needs to be design solutions to the problems that people are experiencing on their streets. Let's talk about Cooper Union.
Cooper Union is an intersection in New York where Bowery splits off into Cooper Square.
The original street only did this.
The Bowery was widened, and there were too many lanes for cars and not enough crosswalks for pedestrians.
What's really interesting is that departments of transportation were actually departments of cars for a long time. And mostly they would describe streets by the number of lanes.
The street ultimately expanded to 4 lanes of traffic, which resulted in a very confusing intersection.
We're seeing everything being 2 ways, 2 moving lanes in every direction, but confusion in the middle. And here's our sidewalk. That is a lot of roadbed, because if I was looking at just dotting in, what a street would be, right? I'm left with a kind of no man's zone here.
For pedestrians, there's no clear way to cross the intersection.
So the way people have tried to deal with it is where you see all sorts of painted medians all over the place to try and kind of tell people what they should be doing.
And it was completely car-focused, which didn't add much to the character of the street.
The bigger you make roads, the more it attracts traffic. But it doesn't really attract things like business, more cyclists, more walking. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a human behavior issue.
The solution? Reduce the number of lanes, add pedestrian crosswalks, and limit the direction of traffic.
Instead of a bunch of streets, you have a very straightforward way, for cars even, which they could not do before, to drive up the street, which is now one way. And what that's done is it's made more sidewalks. And that's really fundamentally what you're seeing with street design, is a way to make streets still serve cars efficiently, but also make it easier for people on buses, people biking. All of these kinds of lanes can kind of shift priorities and give new spaces.
Now, let's head to Brooklyn to take a look at Albee Square. Albee Square is an intersection in downtown Brooklyn where Fleet, Fulton Street, Albee Square West, and Bond Street all meet up.
But many of the subways are sort of off to the corner on very narrow sidewalks.
This area has a lot of pedestrian traffic, but not a lot of space to maneuver, especially since these are small historical streets.
When you have historic streets, they're not always as wide as connector streets that got cleared out because people wanted more lanes. So a lot of the planning that's happening around Albee Square in these remnants of different grids that make up downtown Brooklyn and all the new buildings is to create more room. What do we see on the right-hand side? Well, all of a sudden, this street right here isn't there anymore. But now this street we have a much larger public space. Instead of an island surrounded by streets, we have an island that's now attached to the sidewalk for a beautiful bank building and a new mall called Albee Square Mall that's full of activity.
Next up is Astor Place.
We're at a pretty well-known destination in New York called Astor Place.
Astor Place is an intersection where Lafayette, 8th Street, 4th Avenue, and Cooper Square all converge.
These are streets that are doing a lot of work. In 2016, this was a very confusing place to be. Wide streets, narrow streets. There's a lot of buses hanging out waiting. So people just walked in the street. That's the subway. And there's a number of kind of geometries of streets all cutting through it. That is called the Almo, that people have nicknamed the cube. You see people hang out underneath it. The cube is kind of sitting on also kind of a floating concrete median. And then we have a street here known as Lafayette Street that is going uptown.
In addition to these main streets, Astor Place has a number of historical streets, all feeding into the traffic flow.
This, where I'm drawing this dotted line, is one of the oldest streets in New York, and it got renamed Stuyvesant Street. This street must have started as a dirt path. And in fact, a lot of streets in New York, Center Street, Lafayette, Broadway, were actually just trails. And then they got widened, they got paved.
These multifunctional streets, home to art installation, subway stops, and historical remnants of old New York, are prone to the wear and tear of high traffic areas.
This is not a low space, but there's a lot of flooding that happens if rain comes really, really quickly. What you see now, today, not only is there more trees, but there's actually bioswales and green infrastructure. There's more bike racks, there's bigger sidewalks. You have a huge number of additional green spaces and trees. There's something called the curb line, and the art, I think, of street making is figuring out where the curb goes so that all the buildings look and feel even better. If you put the curb too close to a building or in the wrong alignment, the whole street feels off. So it's sort of like a great room or how clothes fit. Where the curb is kind of like the tailoring of streets. We can start thinking about streets kind of like air and water as the thing that we share. There are private streets, but in general, successful, important streets are shared by just a multiplicity of players, right? And even by walking. So streets, in a sense, are the design problem of today to accommodate getting more out of them and making them attractive to people. But they're also the design problem of the near future.